Okay, Alexander, let's do a follow-up to AUKUS and France. Let's focus on France because France is not letting go of this. Actually, they've even made statements where they've said, I'll paraphrase, they've said, we're not going to let go of this, pretty much. And, they're pissed off at the United States, pissed off at Australia. They're bringing the EU into it. I think that's the biggest development. They are bringing the EU into this. Isn't it interesting that when France runs into these types of trouble, the whole EU gets brought into the fold, but when other countries that are EU members have similar types of geopolitical issues, the EU just kind of says, forget about it. We're not going to deal with this stuff anyway. I guess those are the privileges of being one of the EU big boys. But what's going on with France and AUKUS?
Well, absolutely. What the French are doing, and you're absolutely right about the fact that they have a leverage over the EU and a pull over the EU institutions that only the Germans have to a greater extent. But what the French are doing is that they're using this row, and it's now becoming increasingly clear that that's what they're trying to do. They're using this row as part of their long-term agenda to create a European army and to undermine, in effect, NATO, because they're saying, the Anglo-Saxons, the English-speaking parts of NATO, they can't be trusted. They're not really committed to us at all. They got their own policies. They backstab us in this brutal and cynical fashion. So what we need to do is we need to focus instead on looking to our own defences. We could tell the United States and Britain and indeed Australia to go hang themselves, and let's set up our own European army, look to our own defences, downgrade NATO, and at the same time, which will be the core country that will lead this European army? Well, the only country in Europe that has a military establishment that actually counts for anything very much, and that, of course, is France. Now, whether the French are being realistic about this, I really don't know. I doubt it, actually. But they are starting to gain some traction. There have been voices in Berlin, noises in Berlin, which seem to be increasingly, willing to, look into all of this. And I'm going to say something else. I've been following the British media extremely carefully. Now, the British, for a while, weren't taking all these French complaints seriously. In fact, they were laughing a little at French expense, and they were saying that the French are just, having a hissy fit and throwing a tantrum, and that it's injured vanity. Today is the first day, today that we're making this program, is the first day that I start to notice signs of unease in Britain. And the fact that maybe the French are not just being serious in their complaints, but that, what they're trying to do to set up this European army to undermine NATO, well, it might actually succeed. And there was a very interesting editorial in the Daily Telegraph, which went out of its way to say that French policy is not only just undermining NATO, it's actually working to Putin's advantage, which is, again, when the British say that kind of thing, it begins to suggest that they're getting nervous and rather irritated about what the French are up to. So we'll see whether it succeeds, but that's the French approach. That's the French objective. They wanted this European army for a long time. There's been a lot of resistance to this idea from others in Europe, but they're starting to gain traction in Germany. If they can get the Germans to agree, well, straightforwardly, it will happen.
Yeah. Why do they want an EU army? Is it the money? Because, okay, NATO, there's a lot of money, but it's a lot of money for everybody to take from. Is this just a much better offer for the Europeans that support an EU army? Are they saying to themselves, you know what? NATO's been good to us and it's paid us well, but why should we, share all of this with other countries that are outside of Europe? Let's just hog this whole pie and eat it ourselves. I mean, is that the thinking there? Because you're not moving from a stronger structure to a more strong. No. You're actually going from a stronger to a weaker army. I mean,
that is absolutely the case. I mean, NATO. The European side of NATO has been a joke for a long time, to be straightforward about it. But the United States is a military superpower, despite what some people say it is absolutely a military superpower. There is no country in NATO, in Europe, in the EU, that can remotely replace the power of the United States. So it would be going from a structure, NATO, which is weak in terms of Europe, but strong in terms of the United States, to a structure within Europe that is extremely weak indeed, and in fact so weak that it wouldn't be taken seriously. But there are major advantages to doing this from a French point of view. Firstly, France is far and away the biggest military-industrial complex in Europe. Now, I don't want to exaggerate this. This is not comparable to that of the US, but the French do build the whole range of weapon systems that a great power has. So the French have intercontinental ballistic missiles, they have nuclear-powered submarines, they have nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, and they are the only country in Europe that builds its own fighter jets. The Rafale fighter jet is a sophisticated fighter jet and apparently a highly regarded one. So if you create a European structure for NATO, a European army, it's going to have to be equipped somehow. The Germans have some companies that make weapons, the Italians have some, but ultimately most of the equipment will come from France. And that, of course, is going to be very good for the French. But the other thing that it does, setting up this European army, and this is the real reason why the French are so keen on it, is that the French have repeatedly now found themselves in a inferior position to the Germans, because so long as the EU remains a purely economic and political union, German economic weight outmatches that of France. France is no rival to Germany in terms of economic power, certainly not within the EU. But of course, France has a genuine military, which Germany doesn't. I mean, the French military is much stronger. And if you're going to create an EU army, the core of it inevitably is going to be the French military. So from a French point of view, that gives them a position of something like equality in Germany, because they could go to the Germans and say, well, in Berlin, you lead on economic issues, but we in Paris lead on military and security ones. And that rebalances the French-German partnership and puts it on a more equal foundation. So certainly you'd have a much weaker military system in Europe, and one which the Russians, by the way, would be delighted to see, because they obviously want the United States and Britain and those kind of countries moving out of the picture as much as possible. So the Russians would be pleased to see that happen, but one can see why it would make sense for France, because France will make a lot of money out of all of this, but it would also put itself in a position closer to being a genuine equal to Germany again, and that's something that the French care a lot about.
Yeah, I think if the French have the military component of the EU locked up, I would say they're very equal to the Germans.
Absolutely.
They control the military of the European Union. That would be huge. Huge.
Exactly.
What are the chances, you think? Like a year ago, we would have said EU army and we kind of laughed about it. Do you think the chances now are definitely, they've definitely improved? But do you think it's possible? Now you have Joseph Borrell, and we were actually ahead on this story. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago, actually, before all of this AUKUS stuff broke out. We talked about how Borrell was itching for an EU army as well. That's big, an EU technocrat, one of these unelected guys who's also calling for an EU army. Is it possible? And the follow-up question to that is, if it's possible, would it make Europe, would it make the world a safer place, or would it make it a more dangerous place? I mean, I could definitely see the pluses and minuses of NATO out. We're going to look after our own security. But does it make Europe safer, or is NATO a better option for keeping, quote unquote, the peace? If you could say that.
That is a very good question. But let's talk about the prospects of this. I would still say, on balance, that they're pretty remote. I would have thought that the Germans, in particular, would be very nervous of doing something that will undermine the connection to NATO. But having said that, the Germans are also getting increasingly irritated by the US for all sorts of reasons. They're starting to distance themselves from the US. They're not really signed up to the US game against China. And they're looking at the Biden-Harris administration. They have little confidence in it. And from their point of view, they're increasingly, I think, saying to themselves, well, US policy has led us into a conflict with Russia, which is not in Germany's interests, and it's now wanting to lead us into a conflict with China, where we've got even more interests, and we don't really want to go down that way. So on balance, maybe we might start to explore this idea with the French. And I think that they would probably stop initially from agreeing to an all-embracing European military, but they might agree to perhaps setting up some kind of joint military unit, perhaps the 5,000 strong unit that's been talked about, a German-French unit with the French essentially in control. And who knows, over time, that might lead to something. So I think on balance, it's still unlikely, but you're absolutely right. It has, in fact, evolved much further. It's become more probable now, much more probable now than it was even a few months ago. And the French are leveraging this, and they're leveraging it quite skillfully. Now, would it make the world a safer place or a weaker place? Well, I'm going to say a few things. Firstly, in terms of Europe, it would be a bad thing, because giving the European Union an army, even if it is one which is effectively under Paris's control, is going to strengthen those forces within the European Union that believe in greater European integration. The whole European superstate idea, and I have to say, I think that is unviable in the long term, and I think that's going to create tensions in Europe, which are going to be increasingly difficult to control, and eventually, as we've discussed many times, I suspect that would lead to system collapse, and for the people of Europe it would be a bad thing, and it might conceivably, in the long term, threaten peace in Europe itself. But of course, if we are looking at this in terms of the great geopolitical conflicts around the world, then if you look at it from a perspective of, is NATO a force for peace and stability, or is it more likely an instrument of war, then I think NATO has in fact increasingly become an instrument of war and an instrument creating East-West tensions. And I think a weakening of NATO is going to make regime change wars more difficult. It's going to make Western intervention in all kinds of places less likely. And I think a situation where Paris and Berlin control their own security policies and are not dictated to by Washington and London might, at least in the short term, make for a rather more peaceful situation. And perhaps, conceivably, could just possibly, it might also increase the leverage of those in Europe, in Germany and France, who want to see some kind of détente with Russia. So from that point of view, it might actually make things, in the short term, more peaceful. In the longer term, I can see all sorts of problems in Europe. And I think that that's something, which we have to look at the long term too.
I wonder if the French and some of the EU technocrats are starting to feel like they're getting left behind. And I wonder if a lot of what's happening is another domino from Brexit, in that you have the UK out of the EU. You now seem to have, you definitely have a multipolar world. But what is that multipolar world? It is China with Russia at its back and Eurasia. It's the UK out of the EU, and now it seems you have this Anglo sphere, right? The UK, the US, Canada, Australia, and I'm sure New Zealand will get pulled in. I'm positive of that. So you have this,
and South Africa too. Eventually,
right.
I predict. Yeah.
Right. So you have South Africa as well. So you're going to have this Anglo sphere that's going to be the other pole, right? Going up against the China, Russia, Eurasian part. And I wonder if the Europeans are kind of sitting to themselves, in their nice offices in Brussels, all these technocrats, they're saying, you know what, guys, we're kind of, we're getting left behind. And France has said that. France has said that they felt they were excluded. They have said statements like this where, you've excluded us from these deals. So I wonder if Macron is going there and saying, if we don't do something on our own, we're going to be left behind. So maybe we can be, another pole in this multipolar world. Maybe not as powerful a pole. They'll believe they are powerful, but maybe not as powerful. But we'll still be a kingmaker, so to speak. We'll be relevant as Europe.
I think that is exactly right. I think that's exactly what a lot of people in Paris especially are thinking, and perhaps some people in Berlin. Now, Brexit was a profound shock to the European Union and to the leadership of the European Union. I mean, they never expected that to happen. They lost Britain, and by losing Britain, as is becoming increasingly clear, their connection to the United States has begun to weaken, and that is deeply alarming. But I think what happened with the announcement of AUKUS and with the nuclear submarine deal has come as an even bigger shock. And it's a shock, by the way, which I'm pretty sure that the Biden-Harris administration did not anticipate. I don't suppose even the British realised it. But it has demonstrated to the Europeans in the starkest way how marginal they are becoming, because a United States that is focused on China and on the Pacific, a United States which is dragging Britain along with it, a United States which is retreating into the Anglosphere as it looks to fend off China in the Pacific, is a United States that has less interest in Europe. And I think the Biden-Harris administration didn't understand that. They could have found ways round it. They could have discussed the AUKUS arrangements with France. They could have even offered France a role in it. And that would not have been, it seems to me, a bad policy. It's striking how Biden came along saying that he was going to strengthen US alliances, and this big move that he's just now made, and the others, the British and the Australians have just made, has actually weakened alliances. It's weakened alliances in Europe. That's another discussion. I think there are lots of people in Paris who are saying that. They're saying that the United States is losing interest in Europe, it's focusing on the Pacific, it's getting drawn into a conflict with China, which we have no real interest in. So our objective now must be to prepare for this world, the world after the US, the world after NATO. We've got to build up our European army, our Grande Armée, and perhaps, just possibly, we also need to do that which Macron has been talking about for a long time. We need to start talking finally to the Russians and trying to come to some kind of modus vivendi with them also, because our strength is being sapped by this confrontation with the Russians, which is not really ultimately in our interests. It's an Anglo-American idea. The British are obsessed with it. We're simply losing trade and economic contacts by it. So let's open up to the Russians, as Macron has been repeatedly saying. Let's put NATO behind us. Let's focus on this alliance. Let's distance ourselves from the United States. So that's, I've no doubt at all, those conversations are taking place at this moment in Paris and to a great extent in Brussels too. Whether Germany is signed up for all of this at the moment, I doubt. I think there'll be many Germans, many people at the top in the, Chancellery in Berlin and the ministries there who still want to maintain some kind of connection to the United States. But if policy in Washington continues to be made, as it has been, by the Biden-Harris administration, in the same way without any real understanding of European concerns, then, don't be surprised if Germany swings round and agrees with these voices in France. So we could very well indeed see an attempt being made to try and build up some kind of European power bloc, counterbalancing the Anglosphere and the Russian-Chinese great power axis that's now merging in Eurasia. And that's a real possibility. And if it happens, I would add, it would largely be because of inept diplomacy on the part of the leadership of the United States.
Yeah, interesting. Very interesting. All right, we'll leave it there. theduran.locals.com. Please join us there. You'll find the link down below. And go to the Duran shop, 10% off. Use the code REALNEWS. Look for us on Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, and SuperU, our new media platforms. You'll find all those links underneath this video. Take care.